1 Corinthians 9 to 11. I like the subtitle that my Bible has over chapter 9, A Pattern of Self-Denial. With everything that Paul has been saying so far in our book, and as well as the whole biblical story, after we settle the question of which God to worship, the next question practically posed is, well, then how should I treat my Christian neighbor? And that is, again, largely what the book of Corinthians is about. By the way, this is a good time to introduce a word that we maybe talked about a while back, especially in the Old Testament. The word is Midrash. Midrash is from the Hebrew word to weave. And what Paul will often do is go back and in his mind, go back and grab a verse, a phrase, a sentence out of the Old Testament and weave it into New Testament thinking. He'll do this in chapter 9, verses 9 and 10. It is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Is it oxen God is concerned about, or does he say it for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be a partaker of his hope. And then he applies the story of oxen to humans, and realizing that it's not just oxen he was talking about. So Midrash is something to be watching for. We'll see it again even in our chapters today about the Lord's Supper. The important thing to catch is that Paul is not changing the meaning of the Old Testament when he goes back and grabs a verse and uses it in the New. He's leaving the story alone. He keeps the story going, but he uses words in creative ways, and again in kind of a weaving way to add luster to a new part of the story. Well, let's talk about 1 Corinthians 10 and 11. This is the only time in the New Testament that the Lord's Supper is discussed, so here's a good time, in fact, our only time to talk about it. One of the long-standing traditions in the Roman culture was the deipnon, and we use that word in Jesus' day. It means supper, and it's a full course meal. It's where people sit around a table or tables in a villa, let's say, and the slaves are even part of this. It's an evening meal usually that is rather large. Here is a statement from the Anchor Bible Dictionary. Ancient meal customs placed a higher premium on the symbolic value of table fellowship than is common in the modern Western world. To the ancients, sharing a meal was imbued with ritual meaning and often signified the most solemn and intimate of social relationships. Such conventions were utilized in various social and religious associations. So, that's what's going to be happening with the Lord's Supper, the Lord's deipnon in 1 Corinthians 10 and 11. Well, Paul knew that the Christian community in Corinth needed, well, just that, love, community. They were struggling with sectarian, I am of Paul, I am of Apollos kind of fighting, and he knew that this needed to be solved. So putting this together, Paul saw in the deipnon, in the communal meal, a good picture of the kind of love that really should be just evident in the church as a whole. The dinner party would be giving, in Paul's mind, a practical teaching about the gospel, especially Jew and Gentile relationships. And so here was Paul's teaching. We're going to use the elements of the deipnon, that is the wine and the bread, the food that's on the plate there, to symbolize the visible body of Christ. Remember, we've had Jesus come and go, and he's up here now. So where is the body of Christ in 1 Corinthians? Throughout the whole book, you'll see it numerous times. The body of Christ is not here. It's not here. The body are the parts of Jesus' body that are sitting around the table sharing a common meal. Now, of course, to this point, and here comes the story of 1 Corinthians 10 and 11, the people of Corinth had not been sharing this meal very well. 11:20. Therefore, when you come together in one place, you are not eating the Lord's deipnon, for in eating each one takes his own deipnon ahead of others, and one is hungry and another is drunk. These two people grab their food from the table, from the potluck meal as it were, and head off into a corner of the villa, and they share it alone because they don't like these two people. This group is drunk, and this group over here goes hungry. And here's the point. And here's Midrash again in Paul's way of using the Old Testament. 1 Corinthians 10, 16, and 17. The cup of blessing which we bless. They would pass a cup around. This is common dinner party, Roman kind of thinking. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the fellowship of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the fellowship of the body of Christ? For we, though we are many, are one bread and one body. We are all partaking of one bread. In other words, we pass that bread around. I get your germs, you get mine. No matter, we're part of the same body anyway. We belong to the same group. By the way, evidence for this view that I'm recommending comes about 50 years later in a Christian book called the Didache, the Teaching of the 12. It's one of the first Christian books written outside the Bible, written about AD 100. And in chapter 13 of this book, it tells us the prayer to pray over the communion meal. And here's the prayer they were to pray. We thank you, our Father, for the life and knowledge which you made known to us through Jesus your servant. To you be the glory forever, even as this broken bread was scattered over the hills and was gathered together and became one. So let your church be gathered together from the ends of the earth into your kingdom, for yours is the glory and the power through Jesus Christ forever. So, in summary of what was going on in the Lord's Supper, or the recommendation for how Paul wanted to solve the Lord's Supper that they were already celebrating, here's what I'm saying. The bread and wine that they passed around that day or during those meals did not symbolize Jesus. Jesus, remember, and we have to separate these stories. Here's the point, that back in the end of the Gospels, Jesus led the disciples in what we call the last Passover. And he told them to remember him as they move forward. I take that to mean to remember him in the Passover celebrations they celebrated year after year. The annual celebration of Passover was to now remember Jesus. The people of Corinth did not know this took place. The Gospels had not been written yet. Paul maybe did not even know about the details of this supper. What they were celebrating was a Roman dinner party, and Paul wanted them to remember backwards what Jesus went through the night he was, remember the point of the story, 1 Corinthians 11, on the night that Jesus was betrayed, he shared his food. If Jesus can do it on the night he's betrayed, well, then you need to do it on the day that you celebrate together as a Christian community. So my first point is that the bread and wine did not symbolize Jesus in the communion meal of 1 Corinthians 11. It symbolized the people in the room, the body of Christ, or the Corinthians themselves. And secondly, this take and eat here was not to be repeated. We're not trying in the modern communion meal to recreate the last Passover, just the other way around. We are taking a common element of social life and remembering that if Jesus could do this on the night he was betrayed, if he could share a meal with his enemy, well, then certainly we can share a meal with those that we are supposed to love. So, one more thing, in fact, that really evidences this view of the Lord's Supper that Paul was trying to correct is how to solve what was going wrong. The solution for celebrating the supper improperly or unworthily, it comes out as an adverb in the Old King James. It really just means when you have people going off and some are hungry and some are drunk and they're not getting along during this meal. Well, how do you solve that problem? It's the second to last verse of our reading today. Therefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. The simple solution to the Lord's Supper, in Paul's estimation, was simply all the believers, all the Corinthians, waiting for everyone to come and join together, eating the same food together, and thus showing really a great symbol to the outside world, true Christian fellowship.